I'd like to show you a game played between Hans Niemann and Levon Aronian, and this is from the recent Generation Cup, this online rapid play tournament. Recently there's been a little bit of discussion about Hans Niemann's games, so I thought it'd be interesting to look at one from this very recent tournament. If you remember, Hans did pretty well. He got through the preliminary stage, was knocked out in the quarterfinals. But this is from the preliminary round robin. Niemann playing white against Levon Aronian, who also made it through the preliminary stage but got knocked out. So here we go. It's an open Sicilian. Hans likes a fight, as does Levon. And we get to a Najdorf variation. Well, I'm always very pleased to see that one on the board. Leads to really sharp positions. And Niemann follows recent trends in playing bishop d3. So this is a move that doesn't have such a great reputation in theory, but it's a solid move, and it avoids a lot of the really sharp theory that you get with bishop e3 and bishop g5. It's certainly not a bad move. It can, of course, often transpose into other lines like the Scheveningen with e6, but g6. So now we have a kind of dragon position on the board, but with the pawn on a6. And Niemann decides to play f3. Okay, so it's a little bit unusual. Looks to be like it might head into a kind of Yugoslav attack after bishop e3. Bishop g7. Okay, normal. And that looks at the knight here. So white always has to watch out for tactics, potential pins here. So, well, Niemann plays bishop e2, and this does not look like a very impressive opening from Niemann, it has to be said. We're going into a kind of classical dragon where it's not clear to me that the pawn on f3 is very helpful. It's a curious mix of systems, and yeah, I mean, white has lost the tempo as well by going bishop d3 and back to e2. Knight d7. So looks reasonable. I've often played these kind of systems with black, actually. This kind of mixture of the dragon and the Najdorf. You know, I very much like this setup for black, actually. This is fun. So you're playing a kind of hedgehog setup with black, you know, waiting behind the first three ranks. Queen d2. So, I mean, basically over these last few moves, yeah, I mean, bishop d3 and bishop e2 is kind of weird. But Niemann is kind of back on track with his last few moves, and this looks like a very regular setup, of course, for white. Queen c7, yeah, that's nice. There's no need for black to commit yet, because the centre is pretty closed. But now Niemann, well, having had quite a cagey start, he now decides to go for it with g4. He does have a solid centre, you know, having played f3, so g4 certainly isn't a bad move. But, you know, when I played this kind of setup with black, I was always delighted if one of my opponents lashed out with g4. It always seems to me that this is a kind of a very emotional move. You know, white just thinks, yep, I'm going to attack. But actually, essentially, there's not a lot wrong with black's position. Pawn structure is intact, very nice. Black's pieces are very flexibly placed. So I always thought, well, at some moment this is bound to rebound against white's king, because, of course, this weakens a lot of squares behind the g-pawn. And here, well, Aronian plays knight e5, which certainly doesn't look bad at first glance. Looking to get the knight in here. But actually, it might have been better just to play h6. Not h5, not yet, but h6. Or simply castle here. Because after g5, in fact, I think the knight is okay on h5. And then, let's say knight d5, queen here, f4. But that knight can be driven away from d5. And now this is a typical trick. The knight, which looked vulnerable at the side of the board, steps back in, and black wins the piece back. And suddenly it's all looking a little bit shaky for white. Yeah, very typical of the kind of hits you get in this kind of Sicilian hedgehog position, actually. Okay, let's go back. But instead of castles, instead of h6, knight e5 played by Aronian. And now things actually aren't quite as clear. g5, knight h5 is also interesting here, but knight d7. And now, good move from Niemann, b3. So this, I think this is the first time in the game when I sort of think, well, actually, yeah, I might prefer white. And it suddenly looks a little bit uncomfortable for black because the pawn is going to come to f4, driving away the knight. That square is taken away from it. And white can use this space advantage. And Aronian gets spooked by this move knight d5 and plays e6. Actually, after rook c8, well, I'd rather not go backwards. But actually, this is still rather unclear. Yes, white can establish this Marozzi bind. But because black hasn't castled, then, you know, you can actually play h6 and try and get some counterplay. So it's still quite unclear, actually. But yeah, probably I would prefer white in that position. But coming back here, Aronian obviously saw knight d5 and didn't like the look of it, so plays e6. But I'm afraid this one is just too risky. f4 drives the knight back. Well, the knight could come back, of course, but well, something similar will happen as in the game. Knight b5, basically. But in the game, rook c8 played, looking to get a counterplay here, but then knight b5 attacks the queen. So attacks the queen and also looks at the d6 pawn, and of course the knight can still be taken on e5. Queen takes c2, and this is absolutely crushing. Knight takes d6 check. I mean, it's a very standard Sicilian sacrifice. And now there's no need to plunge in yet with the knight. Pawn takes knight, and, well, rook takes f7 is threatened. Knight takes rook is threatened. Knight takes bishop. It's also on the cards. Well, in short, this is lost for black. And things got even worse. Knight takes e5, which I suppose, you know, could look like a reasonable move because it defends f7. The knight looks quite nice on e5. But instead of taking the material, Niemann found queen b4. Not so difficult. Looking at the king. And now it really is completely lost. Queen takes bishop, and then knight f5 check was the final move. Double discovered check. Aronian resigned because if, let's say, king d7, queen d6 check. And then you can choose between either queen e7 or knight takes bishop checkmate. Let's go with knight takes bishop. There you are. Well, an utter crush. 21 moves, and yeah, Aronian made a horrible blunder with e6. It was uncomfortable at in this position, but certainly not lost. But after e6, yeah, it really was after these moves. So curious game, you know, a very strange start from Niemann playing, well, this move kind of losing a tempo with bishop e2. But once he got here, yeah, he started to play extremely aggressively. You know, he likes going forward, and, well, in this double-edged position, Aronian cracked. I'm going to show you another game by Niemann from this tournament, which, again, I think shows his very aggressive style. So look out for that in the next video. Thanks for watching.